The cloud fills the temple before the king finishes speaking. Gold covers every surface in sight. Incense rises in slow, unhurried spirals toward a ceiling carved with palm trees and open flowers, and on the ridge, just beyond the window, visible, if anyone in that crowded courtyard had thought to look, stands the hill where another kind of altar will one day rise. No one is looking at the hill. Every eye in Jerusalem is fixed on the house itself, on the ark being carried into the dark room at its center, on the priests backing out of that room, unable to stand, unable to finish their duties, because the glory has become too physical a thing to argue with. The procession that brought the ark up from the city of David included, by the text's own count, sacrifices too numerous to record individually. The sound of it, before the silence of the cloud descended, must have been closer to a small war than a worship service, thousands of animals moving through narrow streets, never designed for a crowd this size. Solomon lifts his hands over an assembly larger than any his father ever gathered. Elders from every tribe standing shoulder to shoulder in a courtyard built to hold exactly this many people and not one more. And he speaks the longest prayer of his life, asking God to hear foreigners who travel from distant lands to pray toward this house, asking God to forgive a people not yet born who will one day sin and be scattered and cry out from exile. A request so specific about a future catastrophe that it reads, centuries later, almost like premonition. He is 30-something years old, and he is already, by any measure available to the ancient world, the wisest and wealthiest man alive. Trumpets sound from the courtyard in a pattern rehearsed for months, 120 priests blowing in unison, a wall of sound the text itself takes care to describe, as if the writer needed the reader to understand this was not merely loud, but overwhelming, the kind of sound that makes an entire nation feel, briefly, like a single body. He does not know, or he knows and has already begun the long practice of not thinking about it, that the ridge outside the window has a name waiting for it. Centuries later, a writer working from court records will call it the Mount of Corruption. Not yet. Today, it is only a hill, empty, catching the same afternoon light as the temple, close enough that a man standing where Solomon is standing now could, on a clear day, watch both of them at once without turning his head. His own name carries its own quiet irony, one worth understanding before the story moves any further. Shlomo, Solomon, comes from the same Hebrew root as shalom, peace, and he was given that name according to the record, specifically because his reign was meant to be the peace after his father's decades of war. A king named for peace, spending the first year of his reign settling blood debts and removing rivals, then spending the following decades pursuing peace through an ever-expanding web of marriages designed to make war unnecessary. The irony is not that the strategy failed to produce peace between nations. It largely worked by that narrow measure. No recorded war troubles Israel for most of his 40 years. The irony is that the very method used to buy that outer peace is what dismantles piece by piece the inner peace the name was always meant to describe. Solomon inherits a kingdom built on a promise and a body count. His father, David, spent a reign fighting for borders. Solomon spends his consolidating what those borders now hold. He is not a warrior king. He has never had to be. By the time he takes the throne, The wars are largely finished, the tribute routes are already running, and the only battles left for him are the quiet ones: succession, loyalty, the careful math of who still remembers which side they were on when Adonijah tried to take the crown before his brother could reach it. Joab, David's own general, backed the wrong brother and dies for it near the horns of the altar itself, clinging to the one place in Jerusalem he assumed would grant him immunity. It does not. Solomon's first recorded acts as king are not battles. They are removals. Old debts of his fathers finally called in, old rivals finally settled, a court cleared of the men who might have contested him later. It is not a gentle beginning. It is an efficient one, and efficiency in a young king can look very much like wisdom from a distance. 3 details tell you who this young king actually is, before any title or throne room does. He asks God for an understanding heart rather than long life or riches, a request specific enough that it reads still, like the words of someone who genuinely feared being unequal to the size of the job he'd been handed. He orders a child cut in 2 to expose which of 2 women is lying, a piece of judicial theater so cold it could only have worked in the mouth of someone utterly confident it would, and the entire nation, hearing of it, is said to have stood in awe, recognizing that a wisdom from God was in him to render judgment. And he writes, or is credited with writing, in a tradition consistent enough across sources to be trusted as substantially his. Proverbs about the heart being kept above all else that is guarded, a line that will read decades from now like a warning he handed to everyone except himself. Jerusalem, in Solomon's reign, sits at the hinge of 3 continents' trade, a hill city with no navigable river, no natural harbor, and yet positioned exactly where the caravan routes linking Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia had to pass or pay a toll to avoid. 1 Kings records Solomon's annual gold income at 666 talents, a figure large enough that scholars still debate whether it represents pure bullion tribute or a rounded composite of trade revenue, and either reading points to the same underlying reality: an economy running at a scale Israel had never managed before and would not manage again for centuries. 2 Chronicles cross-references the same building projects: the temple, the palace complex, the store cities, the fortified positions at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, describing a kingdom rebuilt almost overnight into something resembling the great empires it had spent generations fearing. Deuteronomy, written centuries earlier as instruction for exactly this kind of future king, had already specified the danger with uncomfortable precision: that the king must not acquire great numbers of horses, must not take many wives, lest his heart be led astray, and must not accumulate excessive silver and gold. Solomon, whether or not he ever reread that passage as an adult, will eventually break all 3, not in one act of rebellion, but across 4 decades of decisions that each, on their own, looked like ordinary statecraft. The administrative structure Solomon builds to run this economy is itself worth understanding, because it is where the first cracks actually form. 1 Kings divides the kingdom into 12 provisioning districts, each responsible for supplying the royal court with food for 1 month of the year, a rotation efficient on paper, and deeply resented in practice, because the districts do not map cleanly onto old tribal boundaries, and at least one tribe, Judah, appears to be exempted from the burden altogether. The daily provisions listed for the royal table alone are staggering by any ancient standard: flour, meal, fattened cattle, sheep, and game, in quantities that required an entire bureaucracy simply to track and deliver, 12 officers each personally responsible to the crown for their month's allotment, their own households effectively hostage to the success of the harvest in their district. A workforce levy, the MAS, conscripts labor for the building projects. The text insists the heaviest, most degrading labor falls on the remaining Canaanite populations rather than native Israelites, though the line blurs enough in practice that later Israelite memory will remember Solomon's reign for all its glory. As the reign in which forced labor first touched free households, 30,000 men at one point sent in relays to Lebanon, 10,000 a month, working 1 month and resting 2, a rotation that still meant every household with an able-bodied son eventually felt its cost. Whatever the precise legal distinction between conscripted foreign labor and native Israelite service, the resentment that eventually surfaces under Rehoboam does not read like the grievance of populations who felt entirely exempt from the burden. It reads like the grievance of people who had been carrying real weight for decades and had simply, out of loyalty to David's line, chosen not to say so out loud while Solomon himself still sat the throne. This is the tax base that pays for the gold on the temple walls. It is also, 4 decades later, the exact grievance Rehoboam will refuse to lighten, and the exact reason 10 tribes will walk away from his throne within a single meeting. The building projects also leave Solomon in debt to Hiram of Tyre in a way the text does not soften or hide. The gold and cedar advanced across 2 decades of construction eventually exceeds what Solomon can repay in kind, and he settles the balance by handing over 20 towns in the region of Galilee outright, an actual transfer of Israelite territory to a foreign king to cover a construction debt. Hiram, inspecting the towns himself, is unimpressed enough to name the whole district Kabul, a name whose most plausible sense in the local dialect amounts to something like good for nothing, a foreign king's blunt verdict on payment received for the gold that now covers the walls of God's own house. It is, in its own way, the clearest single data point available for what the temple's glory actually cost the kingdom beyond the ledger of talents and offerings. Sovereign territory handed away because even an economy as vast as Solomon's had limits the building projects eventually found. Archaeological work across the ridges south and east of Jerusalem, the area later writers will identify with the Mount of Corruption, has uncovered cultic installations and standing stones from the Iron Age consistent with the kind of open-air high places the biblical text describes, small platform shrines rather than elaborate temples. Exactly the scale of installation a single grieving wife might plausibly have requested, and a court official might have quietly approved without any grand ceremony marking its construction. The picture that emerges from stone is the same picture the text paints in words, not a single dramatic apostasy, but a landscape that accumulated its foreign shrines gradually, hillside by hillside, over the span of a reign long enough for an entire generation to grow up thinking they had simply always been there. The signs arrive early and they arrive small. A treaty is signed with Pharaoh, sealed, as was standard diplomatic custom across the ancient Near East, documented in surviving Egyptian and Hittite treaty archives from centuries before Solomon's own reign. By marriage, and Pharaoh's daughter comes to Jerusalem with her own household, her own gods, and no expectation that she will abandon either. It is, by the standards of the time, an extraordinary concession on Egypt's part. Egyptian princesses were rarely given to foreign rulers at all, which tells you something about how seriously Pharaoh took Israel's growing weight in the region. The practice itself was neither new nor unique to Solomon. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses the Great had sealed his own peace with the Hittite Empire through a treaty later cemented by his marriage to a Hittite princess, an arrangement diplomatic historians still point to as the clearest ancient precedent for exactly the kind of marriage as treaty statecraft Solomon would practice on a much larger scale centuries later. What made Solomon's version different was not the method, it was the sheer volume. A single treaty marriage repeated with variations across every neighboring power he needed to manage until the practice that worked perfectly well as an occasional diplomatic tool became, through sheer accumulation, something closer to an entire alternate religious economy operating inside his own household. A second sign. Horses begin arriving from Egypt in numbers that exceed any defensive necessity, a status commodity as much as a military one, purchased through intermediaries at prices the text itself bothers to record. 600 shekels of silver for a chariot, 150 for a single horse. Numbers precise enough to suggest someone in the court was keeping very careful books. 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen accumulated over the years. A force whose primary purpose seems to have been prestige as much as defense. A third, somewhere in the palace, ledgers, a line item begins that no one in the room notices as significant. The first foreign shrine, small, private, built not for Solomon, but for one wife's private comfort, tucked into a corner of a much larger construction project, where it draws no particular attention at all. A fourth, quieter still. The household staff assigned to each foreign wife grows year by year, until the palace itself begins to function less like a single royal residence, and more like a small federation of separate courts under one roof, each with its own language, its own kitchen customs, its own priests, moving quietly through corridors built for a very different kind of household. Before any of it curdles, there is a version of Solomon worth remembering honestly, not as a setup for tragedy, but because the loss that's coming only means anything if the height it's falling from was real. He asks for wisdom, and God gives him wisdom beyond what anyone expected, along with the riches and honor he did not ask for. The Queen of Sheba travels a caravan route of considerable length. The text situates her kingdom somewhere in the southern Arabian Peninsula, a journey scholars estimate at well over 1,000 miles by camel, through territory hostile enough that the caravan would have required its own armed escort, specifically to test him with hard questions, arriving with spices, gold, and precious stones in quantities the text takes care to specify, because a gift of that scale was itself a form of diplomatic speech, a way of announcing exactly how seriously her kingdom took this new power to the north. She asks him riddles the text declines to record, and he answers all of them, nothing too difficult for the king to explain to her. And she leaves reporting that the report she'd heard had not told her half of it, that his wisdom and prosperity, taken together, exceeded what any account could have prepared her for, and that his officials and servants, simply by standing continually in his presence, must be counted happy. Merchants and kings across the region send envoys to hear him speak. He composes, by tradition, 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs, and writes with the kind of natural authority on trees and animals and the structure of the world that made him, in his own era, something closer to a walking encyclopedia than a mere monarch. He speaks, the text says, of trees from the cedar of Lebanon down to the hyssop growing out of ordinary wallstone, of beasts and birds and creeping things and fish, a range of natural knowledge broad enough that men come from every nation specifically to hear it, sent by kings who had themselves heard reports of a wisdom too large to be adequately summarized secondhand. It is not merely political or administrative wisdom. It is the kind that notices small, ordinary things, a stone wall's hyssop, an ant's industry, and finds in them a pattern worth writing down for people who would otherwise walk past such things without a second glance. It is worth sitting with the contrast this creates later in the story, a man capable of that kind of patient, careful attention to an ant's small habits, somehow failing, across 4 decades, to apply the same attentiveness to the slow accumulation happening on the ridge directly outside his own window. Wisdom about the natural world, it turns out, is not the same wisdom required to notice your own life, changing shape one permission at a time. The gap between those two kinds of attention is, in the end, the whole story this episode is built around, not a fall caused by any dramatic villain or single catastrophic decision, but a fall caused by exactly the kind of slow, undramatic inattention that never once feels in any single moment like inattention at all. A navy built with Hiram's Phoenician sailors, men from a coastal kingdom with generations of open sea experience that landlocked Israel simply did not possess. Sails from Etzion Geber down the Red Sea to Ophir and returns with gold, and later expeditions bring back algum wood, precious stones, and by the text's own memorable detail, apes and peacocks, exotic enough that whoever first wrote the account clearly thought them worth naming individually. There is a strange tenderness folded somewhere into this same period of his life, one easy to miss if you are only reading for political marriages and treaty documents. Tradition credits Solomon with the Song of Songs as well as the Proverbs, a long, unguarded love poem built entirely around one voice, desiring one particular person, not a treaty, not a dowry, not a foreign household, but a single beloved described in the kind of specific, almost embarrassed detail that reads like a man who once knew, at least briefly, what wanting someone for their own sake actually felt like. Set beside the register of 700 marriages and 300 concubines, that poem becomes almost unbearably poignant. Whatever it was Solomon once understood about love as something other than diplomacy, it is a capacity the rest of his story will spend decades slowly converting into policy. He is younger, barely more than a boy in some ancient reckonings, kneeling at Gibeon, after a night in which God appeared to him in a dream and asked the single most dangerous question a new king could be asked: "What do you want me to give you?" And he does not ask for the obvious things. He asks to be able to tell right from wrong for a people too large and too complicated for him to govern by instinct alone. He asks, essentially, to not fail them. And God, pleased that he did not ask for his enemies' lives or endless riches, gives him both the wisdom and the wealth anyway, an abundance he did not request, arriving as a kind of grace attached to a request that was, for once, not about himself. The throne room he eventually builds to hold all of this reflects exactly what it was meant to reflect: an ivory throne overlaid with fine gold, 6 steps leading up to it, 12 lions standing at intervals along the steps, unlike anything made in any other kingdom of the period, according to the text's own comparison. Visiting delegations are shown golden drinking vessels at every meal. The text notes, almost as an aside, that none of the household vessels were silver, because silver was accounted as nothing in Solomon's days, a detail meant to communicate an abundance so complete that an entire precious metal had effectively been demoted by comparison. The temple itself takes 7 years to build, employing, by the text's own accounting, a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands, cedar shipped down from Lebanon under a formal trade agreement with Hiram, king of Tyre, floated as rafts along the coast to Joppa, and hauled overland up to Jerusalem, stone-cut and dressed at the quarry so that, famously, no hammer or iron tool is heard at the building site itself. It is, by any ancient standard, one of the great architectural undertakings of its era. Gold overlay on cedar walls, cherubim carved with wings spanning the width of the inner sanctuary, a bronze sea resting on 12 oxen for the priest's ritual washing, 10 bronze basins on wheeled stands positioned along the courtyard, a scale of bronze casting work so extensive that the text notes it had to be done in the Jordan Valley, in clay ground, because Jerusalem itself had no foundries capable of the volume required. When it is finished, Solomon does not simply dedicate it. He offers, by the text's count, 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep in sacrifice, a number so large it likely represents the entire nation's participation across the full festival period, rather than a single day's slaughter, but a number, regardless, that no reader of the period could have mistaken for anything but total, unreserved devotion. The middle of the courtyard has to be specially consecrated because the standard bronze altar cannot physically hold the volume of offering being brought to it. He walks the finished courts at night sometimes, alone, before the dedication, running a hand along cedar paneling, still faintly sharp with the smell of Lebanon. This is the thing he will be remembered for. He knows it even as he stands there. He thinks, standing in the dark sanctuary with no one else present, of his father pacing this same hillside decades earlier, forbidden from building this house himself, because his hands, God had said, carried too much war on them. And Solomon understands in that quiet moment that he is finishing something his father wept over, never being allowed to start. For one uncomplicated evening, before any of what's coming has had the chance to begin, he is simply a man who built something his father only dreamed about, standing in it, and it is enough. This is who mattered before any of the rest of it. This is the loss the second half of the story is actually about. The temple's completion does not end Solomon's building projects. It begins a second, much longer one, his own palace complex, the House of the Forest of Lebanon among its buildings, so named for the 4 rows of cedar pillars running the length of its main hall, which the text notes, almost in passing, takes 13 years to complete, nearly twice as long as the temple itself. The detail is easy to read past. It is not incidental. A king whose personal residence outpaces God's house in both scale and duration is a king whose priorities have already begun quietly to reorder themselves long before any single dramatic scene announces it. The palace complex includes a separate house built specifically for Pharaoh's daughter, positioned, the text is oddly specific about this, outside the walls immediately surrounding the ark's former resting place. Because Solomon himself reasons that no wife of his, however politically necessary, should live in ground that holy. It is, in its own strange way, evidence that some part of him understood exactly what these arrangements were and were not permitted to touch. That understanding, whatever its sincerity in the moment, does not hold. The marriages continue, and they are, almost without exception, transactions rather than romances. Treaties with Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and the Hittite territories, each one a diplomatic instrument as standard in that world as a modern trade agreement, each one bringing with it a foreign household that expects, reasonably by its own customs, to keep its own religious practice intact. Among them, though the text names her only briefly, is Naamah the Ammonite, mother of the son who will one day inherit not a unified kingdom, but a fractured one, a detail the narrative leaves sitting quietly in a genealogical note until its full weight becomes clear decades later. By the time the count is taken, Solomon has 700 wives of royal rank and 300 concubines, a number so vast it cannot be read as personal appetite alone. It is policy. It is, in its own way, diplomacy functioning exactly as diplomacy is supposed to function, which is precisely the problem, because Deuteronomy's warning was never about romantic excess. It was about exactly this: a king whose foreign policy runs quite literally through his own household, until the household itself becomes a second competing seat of religious authority inside his own capital. A quiet domestic scene, easy to overlook in the text, but impossible to overlook in its implications. One wife, grieving the absence of a God she was raised to worship since childhood, in a household far from everything and everyone she has ever known, asks, not demands, asks, for a small shrine of her own. Solomon does not personally build it. He authorizes it. He allocates the land, the materials, the labor. The distinction matters to him, apparently, though it will not matter at all to the historical record, which will remember only that it happened under his rule and with his consent, on a hill his own capital city can see from nearly every quarter. It is only one hillside, he tells himself, more than once. In the years the pattern repeats. It costs me nothing to let her have this. She is far from home. What kind of man would refuse her this small thing? It is not worship. It is comfort. There is a difference, surely. Each sentence is, on its own terms, defensible. None of them, spoken once, could be mistaken for apostasy. That is exactly how the erosion works. No single conversation in this pattern would read on its own as betrayal. It is only in aggregate, a shrine for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and another for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites, rising one after another on the same ridge across a span of years, that the pattern becomes impossible to describe as anything but what it is. There is a particular kind of conversation that recurs across these years, always some variation of the same exchange, always framed by both parties as being about something smaller than it actually is. A wife reminds him, gently, of what her father's alliance secured for his southern trade routes, what her people's friendship still costs him nothing to maintain, what a small gesture of religious accommodation would mean for the continued warmth between their two houses. Solomon listens, understanding the argument completely, because it is, in the narrowest political sense, entirely sound. The marriages did secure exactly what they were meant to secure, and the ongoing peace with Moab or Ammon or Sidon really does depend, in some measure, on these households feeling at home rather than merely tolerated. What the argument never quite has to address, because no one in the room is required to say it aloud, is the second cost running underneath the first, that every accommodation purchasing outer peace is quietly withdrawing from an account Solomon can no longer see the balance of, until the day arrives when a prophet tears a cloak into pieces and shows him the statement in full. It does not come from a prophet standing in a doorway with fire in his eyes. It comes, if the pattern of the era is any guide, from inside his own household, a senior wife or a trusted advisor, watching the accumulation of foreign shrines across the ridgeline opposite the temple, and asking him plainly whether he intends to let it continue. The opposition here is not theatrical. It is exhausted, practical, even sympathetic to him. Is this really so different from what your father tolerated in the frontier towns? Is this really worth the fight it would take to undo it now, this late? You built one house for the Lord. Does he really begrudge you allowing the rest of us our small comforts? The manipulation, if it can be called that, is not malicious. It is the manipulation of accumulated normalcy, of a thing that has been happening long enough that stopping it now would require Solomon to admit publicly that it should never have started, and to undertake the far harder, far more visible work of tearing down what he spent years quietly permitting. A meal late in his reign, at which foreign gods' names are spoken at his own table without anyone in the room treating it as remarkable. A shift so gradual that no single dinner marks its beginning, only its eventual, undeniable normalcy. Guests from Sidon and Moab and Ammon, each observing their own customs at the same long table where, decades earlier, only the God of Israel would have been named at all. A public appearance, Solomon presiding over a festival, dressed in the full weight of his office, radiating the confidence expected of the wisest king alive. The crowd below him utterly convinced they are looking at the same devoted king who once offered 120,000 sheep in a single dedication, set against a private moment, hours earlier, in which he sat with his head in his hands, aware, in a way he cannot say out loud to anyone in his court, that something in him no longer fully believes what he is about to publicly perform. A conversation with one of his sons, likely Rehoboam, though the text does not dwell on it, in which the real subject is never named. They talk about trade routes, about the price of horses, about a border dispute with Edom that has been simmering for years. They do not talk about the altars on the hill. Both of them can see the hill from where they're standing, its outline visible through the window behind Solomon's chair. Neither mentions it. Rehoboam, watching his father's face in that unguarded moment, files something away without knowing yet what to call it. A lesson, absorbed rather than taught, about how a king manages the things he would rather not manage at all. It is not hard to imagine watching that silence stretch between father and son, exactly where a future king might learn that some problems are simply inherited rather than solved. There are other, smaller identification scenes scattered across these years, easy to miss individually. A late-night reading alone of his own earlier writing, a line about vanity, about chasing the wind, about all his works being examined and found, in the end, to profit nothing under the sun, and the uncomfortable question of whether he wrote that as philosophy or as confession. A moment at a window, watching one of his younger wives walk toward the ridge with an attendant carrying incense, and choosing deliberately to look away rather than ask where she is going, because he already knows, and knowing without acting has become, by this point, its own kind of habit. He does not fall to his knees when it happens. There is no single recorded scene of collapse. I built the house myself. I stood in the cloud. His hands, some quiet evening, rest on a window ledge overlooking the ridge. Not shaking, just still. Still in a way that feels to him unfamiliar. His breath does not catch. It simply slows, the way breath slows in a room that has gone unexpectedly cold. The weight in his chest is not sharp. It is dull, old, like something he has been carrying for years without ever setting down long enough to feel how heavy it had become. His eyes fix on a single object, an oil lamp, unlit, sitting on a table near the window, the kind of object he has walked past 10,000 times without seeing it. He does not know how long he stands there. That was the moment something inside him that had always believed finally stopped. Not a crisis of faith in the dramatic sense, something quieter and harder to name. The recognition, arriving without ceremony, that he has become the very warning written centuries earlier for a king exactly like him, and that recognizing it now does not undo any of the years it took to arrive here. He does not weep. He does not pray. He stands at the window a long time, and then he goes to bed, and in the morning he rules exactly as he ruled the day before. There are nights later in his reign when sleep will not come, not from any single crisis, but from the accumulated weight of a life spent managing contradictions he can no longer fully separate in his own mind. He eats less at his own table than the abundance around him would suggest, pushing food around a golden plate, while envoys from 3 different kingdoms wait for him to speak. A servant notices, says nothing. It is not the kind of thing anyone in that court is equipped to raise with the king, and Solomon, for all his fabled wisdom, has built a household in which no single person holds the standing to say the hard thing to his face. There are evenings he retires early before the customary hour, leaving foreign delegations to wonder among themselves whether the wisest king alive is unwell, and no one in the room possessing either the rank or the courage to ask him directly. He lies awake afterward in a bedchamber built, like everything else in that palace, on a scale meant to overwhelm visitors, and finds that scale offering him nothing at all in the specific currency he actually needs that night, which is simply the presence of one honest voice. A prophet named Ahijah, the text names him plainly from Shiloh, meets a young official named Jeroboam on a road outside the city, a man Solomon himself had earlier promoted for his competence in overseeing the labor levy from the house of Joseph, and tears his own new cloak into 12 pieces, handing Jeroboam 10 of them, a piece of prophetic theater impossible to keep quiet in a court this size. Jeroboam is not, at this point, an enemy of the throne. He is one of its own success stories, a capable young administrator from the tribe of Ephraim, whom Solomon had personally noticed and promoted, entrusting him with oversight of the very labor levy whose weight was, even then, becoming a quiet source of resentment across the northern tribes. That Solomon's own judgment in choosing capable men is what places Jeroboam on that road, in that position, at the exact moment Ahijah finds him, is its own small, bitter irony. The king's discernment about talent still fully intact, even as his discernment about everything else has quietly eroded. The road itself runs outside the city gates, away from any court witnesses, the kind of place a prophet chooses precisely because what happens there needs to reach the right ears without first passing through the wrong ones. The Lord will tear the kingdom from Solomon's hand, Ahijah says, in words the text preserves almost exactly, and will give 10 tribes to you. For they have forsaken me, the prophecy continues, and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the Ammonites. Word reaches Solomon within days, carried by someone who clearly felt the king needed to hear it regardless of the cost to the messenger. He is not merely losing his own private peace anymore. He is being publicly, unambiguously informed by a source his entire kingdom will recognize as legitimate, a prophet whose earlier words about his own father David had proven true, that the consequences of the last decades are no longer contained to his conscience. They have become policy. They have become succession. Everyone at court now knows what only Solomon suspected in the quiet of his own room. And there is a particular kind of shame in that, not the shame of the sin itself, but the shame of it becoming suddenly common knowledge. Foreign envoys, who days earlier had marveled openly at the scale of his wisdom and wealth, now exchange careful, unreadable glances whenever the succession is mentioned in his presence. A shift in the room's temperature so subtle that no single person could be accused of causing it, and yet unmistakable to a king who has spent 40 years learning to read exactly this kind of silence in a crowded hall. He continues receiving them with the same measured hospitality he always has. It costs him considerably more now than it once did, though nothing in his outward bearing gives that away. This, too, is a kind of discipline, perhaps the last kind of discipline still fully available to him, the discipline of continuing to perform the duties of the office correctly, even after the office's future has been publicly, prophetically settled without his input. He wonders, in the space no one else is permitted to see, whether he misread the entire shape of his own life, whether the wisdom he was given at Gibeon was ever meant to survive contact with 700 marriages, or whether he had simply assumed, without ever testing the assumption, that a mind sharp enough to judge disputed infants would be sharp enough to judge its own compromises. It had not been. He wonders whether that failure was inevitable the moment he accepted the first political marriage, sealed with Pharaoh's own daughter, before he had reigned even a full year, or whether there was a later point, the 10th wife, the 50th, the 300th, where a different man, a more careful man, might have stopped. He turns the question over more nights than he would ever admit to anyone, and never arrives at an answer that lets him rest. He remembers, some nights, the 2 women and the disputed infant, the sword raised over the child while the court held its breath, and the absolute clarity he felt in that single moment of judgment. A clarity he searches for now in far larger and far slower moving matters, and simply cannot locate anymore. That case, decades earlier, had made him famous across the entire region within a single season. A young king's name suddenly attached everywhere to the idea of God-given discernment. He wonders, some nights, whether that early fame itself became part of the problem, whether a man convinced early enough of his own discernment stops checking it as carefully as a man who is still uncertain of it would. It is one thing to see truth clearly in an instant, under pressure, with an entire court watching. It is another thing to see it clearly across 40 years of gradual, undramatic accumulation, where no single moment ever presents itself plainly enough to demand the same kind of decisive verdict. A sword raised over a disputed child announces itself as a moment requiring judgment. A dinner table where a foreign god's name is spoken for the 1,000th time, indistinguishable by then from the 999 times before it, announces nothing at all. He wonders whether that is simply the nature of the 2 kinds of wisdom, the fast kind and the slow kind, and whether God's gift at Gibeon was only ever meant to cover the first. An old comfort reappears in this period, plausible though not explicitly detailed in the text, perhaps a return to the easier certainties of his youth, a wish to simply enjoy the wealth and the wisdom he was given, and stop wrestling with any of it, to let the kingdom's fracture be someone else's problem entirely, a problem for Rehoboam, a problem for a future he will not live to see. He hesitates over this. The exhaustion of continuing to care is, by this point in his life, its own kind of burden, heavier some days than the actual work of ruling. He does not take the easier path. Scripture gives no indication he abandons the temple worship or actively renounces the God of his father, and the text credits him even now with wisdom that continued to attract visitors from distant courts. But the refusal costs him. It is not framed as heroic. It is framed, if anything, as simply what remains available to a man too far into the consequences to turn fully back and too proud or too tired to fully repent aloud, to tear down with his own hands the altars he authorized with his own signature. There is a version of these later years easy to imagine even where the text does not describe it directly, in which Solomon considers simply handing the daily governance of temple affairs to a subordinate priest entirely, stepping back from any direct association with worship at all, rather than continuing to preside, however imperfectly, over both the house of the true God and the hillside of foreign altars at once. It would be, in a strange way, the easier path, a clean division of labor, a way of no longer having to hold both realities in the same set of hands. He does not take it. Whatever remains of the young man who once knelt at Gibeon, asking not to fail his people, apparently will not let him fully step back even now, even this late, even knowing the outcome has already been decided over his head. There is in that refusal something worth naming plainly, even if the text itself never pauses to name it. A man who cannot undo 40 years of compromise, still choosing, day after day, not to add abandonment to the list of things his son will one day inherit from him. It is a smaller mercy than full repentance would have been. It is not nothing. There is no recorded friend who sits with him through this. If anyone close to him raised the subject honestly, the record does not preserve it, which is, in its own way, the loneliest detail of all. A king surrounded, by the text's own count, by more household members than any ruler in his nation's history, 700 wives and 300 concubines and advisors and priests and foreign envoys, filling every corridor of a palace that took 13 years to build, and not one companion positioned to simply say the hard thing and stay in the room afterward. The loneliness of that particular kind of crowd is its own quiet tragedy, one the text never states outright but leaves entirely visible in what it does not record. If any single court priest did attempt to raise the matter, the likeliest form that conversation took, given the customs of the era, was theological rather than personal. A recitation of the law's requirements, a formal reminder of Deuteronomy's warning about kings and horses and wives and gold, delivered with the kind of correct, distant precision that satisfies a religious obligation without ever actually reaching the man sitting across the room. Solomon, if such a conversation happened, would have known every word of that recitation better than the priest reciting it to him. What he did not have, by every indication the record leaves, was a single person willing to set the theology aside and simply ask him, without an agenda beyond friendship, how he was actually doing underneath the gold and the glory and the 700 marriages nobody around him seemed able to name as the source of his exhaustion. There is no dramatic reversal recorded for Solomon, no scene of him tearing down the altars himself, no public repentance matching the scale of his public dedication decades earlier. What the text offers instead is smaller, and in its smallness, more honest. God tells him plainly, through what the record frames as direct communication, that the kingdom will be torn away, but not in Solomon's own lifetime, and not the whole of it, for the sake of David his father, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which God has chosen to keep one tribe under his son's rule regardless. The first small act available to Solomon in the years remaining to him is not restoration. It is acceptance without collapse, continuing to govern, continuing to hold the kingdom together for the time he has left, continuing to receive foreign envoys and render judgments and maintain the vast administrative machine he built. rather than abandoning the throne to despair, now that its future has already been decided without him. It is a smaller kind of dignity than the version he might have hoped for at 30, standing in the cloud. But it is not nothing. Some months later, the adversaries God raised against him in his later years. Hadad the Edomite, a survivor of David's earlier campaigns who had fled as a child to Egypt and now returns to trouble Solomon's southern border, and Rezon in Damascus, a former commander who carves out his own kingdom on Israel's northern flank, continue their pressure on the kingdom's borders, a slow erosion visible now in trade routes and tribute rather than any single dramatic battle. Solomon manages both threats without losing his throne, but the ease of his earlier reign, the decades in which the borders simply held without needing tending, does not return. Weeks pass in which reports from both frontiers arrive with a regularity that never quite rises to the level of open war, but never fully subsides either, a low, grinding pressure entirely unfamiliar to a king who spent the middle decades of his reign never once having to think seriously about his borders at all. It is a strange kind of aging, watching a kingdom that once required almost no defending begin to require constant low-level attention again, a reminder that the peace his name once promised was never quite as permanent as 4 uninterrupted decades had made it feel. Solomon himself, reviewing the frontier reports in whatever private chamber he keeps for such things now, allows himself, perhaps for the first time in years, a small and quietly bitter recognition that a name meaning peace was never actually a guarantee, only ever a hope his father had placed on him at birth. And hopes, unlike treaties, come with no enforceable terms at all. It is a recognition he keeps to himself, the way he has kept nearly everything to himself these later years, and the keeping itself has become, by now, simply another feature of the life he built. 2 months after that, Jeroboam, warned that Solomon seeks his life after Ahijah's prophecy becomes known at court, flees to Egypt to the protection of Pharaoh Shishak, the same Egypt whose princess once arrived in Jerusalem as a bride, sealing an alliance that felt at the time like the beginning of everything, its own descendants now sheltering the man who will one day tear the kingdom in half. Solomon receives the report of Jeroboam's flight without any recorded reaction beyond the practical. The man is gone, the immediate threat contained, the deeper problem entirely unresolved. The day he realizes he is going to survive this, whatever survival can mean for a man who already knows the ending, is not marked by any single triumph. It is marked by an ordinary morning of court business, petitions heard, a trade dispute settled, a foreign delegation received with the same measured hospitality he has shown for 40 years. Proof of a sort that a life does not have to end in collapse simply because it has already been judged. The elders who have served him longest begin, quietly, to speak with Rehoboam more often than they once did. A shift in attention Solomon notices without commenting on, understanding it for exactly what it is. The natural gravity of a court already beginning, in small ways, to orient itself toward whatever comes next. Rehoboam himself, by all available indication, spends these years absorbing the mechanics of rule without absorbing its harder lessons. watching his father manage envoys and treasuries and building projects, but arriving, whether through his own temperament or through simple lack of direct instruction, at conclusions considerably harsher than the ones his father actually held. He grows up, after all, inside a household his father built specifically to project unassailable strength. Golden vessels, an ivory throne, delegations arriving from every neighboring power to marvel at what Israel had become. And a young man raised entirely inside that display of strength can be forgiven, if not excused, for concluding that strength displayed is the same thing as strength that lasts. He will one day tell the men who ask him to lighten the labor levy that his father chastised them with whips, and he will promise them scorpions instead. A threat far crueler than anything Solomon himself is recorded as having said in 40 years of rule, and a chilling suggestion that whatever Rehoboam learned by watching his father's later, quieter compromises, he learned it as license rather than as warning. By the time Solomon's reign nears its end, he has ruled 40 years. The text gives no indication of any late dramatic reformation, only the plain record that he dies and is buried in the city of David. And Rehoboam, his son, reigns in his place, inheriting a kingdom whose fracture lines are already, by then, structurally fixed, waiting only for the tax burden his father built, to finally, formally break it apart. Within a single generation, the elders who once served Solomon will advise Rehoboam to lighten that burden, and Rehoboam, choosing the counsel of younger men who grew up beside him in that same overcrowded palace, will refuse, and 10 tribes will walk away from Jerusalem in the space of one afternoon, completing in a single meeting what 4 decades of small permissions had already made structurally inevitable. There is no revenge in this ending, because there was no external enemy to take revenge on. The only opponent in this story was accumulation, small permissions, compounding, across 4 decades, until a wisdom celebrated across the known world could not, in the end, save the very thing it was given to protect. Solomon does not humiliate anyone in his final years, and no one humiliates him. He simply continues, governing a kingdom that both he and everyone around him now understand will not remain whole past his own lifetime. And there is a kind of unglamorous dignity in that continuation, a refusal to abandon the throne simply because its long-term outcome has already been decided. Solomon's story does not end with a villain defeated or a wound healed. It ends with a ledger finally, fully read, by a man who spent 40 years assuming the account would never actually come due. The wisest man who ever lived, by his own kingdom's account, still could not outthink 40 years of small, reasonable-sounding yeses, which may be the most sobering historical detail this entire episode has to offer. That the danger was never a failure of intelligence at all, but a failure of the much slower, much less glamorous discipline of noticing what 1,000 small permissions add up to before the final tally arrives. It is a warning that travels considerably better across 3,000 years than most ancient warnings do, precisely because it was never really about kings or thrones or 700 marriages specifically. It was always about the particular danger of believing that wisdom, once given, is a permanent possession rather than a discipline requiring daily renewal. The final scene is quiet. An old king, somewhere in the palace, he spent 13 years building, looking out, one more time, at the ridge across from the temple. The altar's still standing there, the consequence of 1,000 small yeses he can no longer individually account for. He does not tear them down. He does not defend them either. He simply looks the way a man looks at a debt he knows will be paid by someone else in a currency he will not live to see collected. Behind him, faintly, through the palace's own high windows, the temple itself is still visible on its own hill, gold catching whatever light remains of the day, the same building he once stood inside decades earlier, while a cloud filled it too completely for the priests to keep their footing. Both buildings are still standing. Both hills are still visible from where he stands now, exactly as they were on the day of the dedication, when neither he nor anyone else in that vast crowd thought to look at the second one at all. He looks at both of them now, for what may be the last time he has the strength to make the walk to this particular window, and says nothing, because there is, at this point, nothing left to say that the two skylines do not already say more plainly than he could. If a single small compromise has ever felt to you like it cost nothing, tell me in the comments what it actually cost. I read every one, every time.